Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next episode of All In, the Sustainable Business Podcast. I'm Chris Coulter, and I'm here with Mark Lee today. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Chris, really happy to be here again today and excited for today's guest and the conversation we're going to have.
Yes, and our guest, I'm excited too. It's someone I've known for a while and an organization I've known for a while too, and it's Charlotte Moore, the Chief Executive of SIGWATCH. Hi, Charlotte.
Hey Chris, how you doing today?
Good, good. Thanks for joining us, and we're excited to dig into the whole pressure ecosystem for business and activism, and maybe to get us to that place. Tell us about you. So you're the CEO of SIGWATCH. What is SIGWATCH? Where did it come from? What did you do? How did you get to where you are? All the good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. SIGWATCH essentially is a company that helps other companies, big organizations, understand how pressure is shaping their operating landscape. And so when we talk about pressure, we're talking about groups, organizations, individuals that are, I suppose, deliberately shaping regulation, public opinion, um, the way that companies approach certain things, the way that investors approach certain things. So that might cover big NGOs, the sort of major NGOs like WWF, Greenpeace, whoever that might be.
Mhm.
It covers think tanks. It covers smaller, I suppose, sort of diffuse campaigning groups, grassroots organizations, whoever it might be that is out there campaigning with a cause.
Mm.
And we focus really specifically on these pressure groups because, first of all, they have a really big impact on how businesses operate. But a lot of businesses tend to overlook them. They only really pay attention when they're sort of engaged in maybe a kind of adversarial interaction.
And
But
a real campaign when rubber hits they're outside the gates, and then
exactly,
we engage. Yeah.
exactly. Someone is standing outside of your HQ with a sign, and then you start paying attention.
Mhm, mhm.
And companies will spend a huge amount of money understanding a range of their stakeholders, right? You have all this media monitoring, you have consumer surveys. I mean, a lot of what you do as well, Chris.
They're not spending enough, Charlotte, just to be clear. They should spend.
Good. And they should spend more.
Yeah.
We're all saying that, but they're spending some. But this is a stakeholder that a lot of businesses aren't paying attention to. And so what we're trying to do in our work is help them to understand what is the pressure out there? What are these campaigns? What are the demands? What is being pushed for? What is being praised? What is being criticized? How is this shaping the environment that you're operating in? And how does this change how you manage things going forwards? Because it inevitably is going to affect you. It's just a question of, do you engage or do you not engage? Um, so it's quite a specific focus. It's quite a niche
Mhm.
focus. But really it plugs into so many different aspects of business in so many different areas. And SigWatch, the company, actually has been around, I believe, sort of 25 years, so longer than I've been with the company. It was founded by Robert Blood, who actually came out of the PR industry, and he had worked with a number of companies who had been blindsided by activist campaigns or NGO campaigns. It sort of came out of nowhere, and there was all this controversy and ill feeling, and no one sort of knew what was going on or how to handle it. And so he started SigWatch to help companies to understand this phenomenon a bit better and engage in a constructive way rather than in a sort of, oh no, I'm in trouble, defensive way.
That's wonderful,
Um,
and he's yeah, he's a real a wonderful man and a great pioneer on this methodology, and
Absolutely.
filling in that space for and visualizing, right, where these pressures are coming from, how they're moving up and down. And maybe could you just describe a little bit of the methodology? 'Cause I find the SIGWATCH methodology fascinating too, and quite robust and precise. So and then I'm sure Mark wants to jump in with some questions.
Yeah, definitely. So we're really, really focused on data quality because what we're trying to do is distinguish the signal from the noise
Mm.
at quite an early stage. And so in order to do that, we're not doing any media monitoring and we're doing almost no social media monitoring. We're looking directly at what we call the pressure groups channels of communication, their primary channels of communication. 9 times out of 10, that's their website or their press release page. And so this is information that they are putting out publicly. This is reports, announcements of protests, whatever it might be. we're not really looking at social media unless that is their primary channel of communication, because we're trying to distill out the activity, the action that's really going to lead to something, rather than just what we're putting out for the sake of saying something, if you see what I'm saying.
Excellent.
And Charlotte, a couple of follow-ups from me, and I think I don't know the organization as well as Chris. Maybe my ignorance will help the listeners as well. You mentioned the degree to which it's niche and the focus on activist groups, and I wondered how far does the definition of activist extend? Like, would it also include activist investors, or is it only civil society organizations?
So we talk about pressure groups, and that would cover activist groups, sort of the pure activist groups, and it would cover some activist investors. So if we look at Share Action in the UK, for example, their main purpose is to invest with a view to affect change on a particular issue. And that issue tends to be ideological. So it might be something around climate or human rights or whatever it may be. So those kinds of groups would fall into our methodology, but the sort of engine number one kind of activist investors, they would not necessarily at this stage.
And then I find it really, really interesting that you said almost no media, almost no social media. We're going to source, we're looking at websites, we're looking at press releases, we're looking at what the organizations say. And there's a part of me that thinks that's fantastic because there's a distortion quality when things filter. And then I wonder, how do you then interpret the weight or the gravity of what's being said? Because there's a tree falling in a forest nobody hears. If it's not being amplified through media or on social media or otherwise, how do you
Mm.
then judge what you find at source and its kind of meaning and its materiality for folks?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a complementary tool, really. And all of this forms part of what we would talk about as the issue spectrum. So what we're looking at is the first piece, and then you would follow on from that and look at how does it develop in the media. So that is something that we keep an eye on. It's just not the data that we specialize in. But in terms of our own data, we monitor gravity by using what we call the reputational impact score. So whenever we pick up a campaign action or a pressure group action, we're looking at who's involved, how big is the group, is it Greenpeace International, in which case it has significant reach and is probably going to be quite impactful, or is it a very small, very niche group that's just popped up and is, for example, in a state in the US. So it's really quite regional, in which case we would downgrade the potential impact of that. We're also looking at sentiment. Um, so we would look at sentiment, for example, for a corporate mention. Is it really, really heavily criticized? Is this corporation like the devil? Are they doing something terrible? Or is it, oh, maybe they shouldn't be doing that, but actually they're doing some things that are good. And so we take that into account. We take into account prominence, we take into account volume. So there are all these different metrics that we're looking at to say this is either a flash in the pan and you don't necessarily need to worry too much about this. You engage with the narrative, but it's not sort of a big crisis waiting to happen. Or actually this is something that's come out of nowhere and it's built really quickly and it's being picked up by lots of really prominent groups and it's gone from one region to a global issue, and this is, we're ringing alarm bells on this. You really, really need to be aware of this.
So momentum sounds like a huge factor there, that you sort of find a
Absolutely.
pressure point and then look for almost its kind of snowball effect.
Mhm.
Yeah, I have so many more follow-ups, but Chris,
Yeah,
jump back in.
well, just
Yeah.
maybe what's your reflections, Charlotte, on the pressure landscape in the last couple of years? Like what's changing? What's different than 5 years ago? Say, what are you picking up? How
Yeah,
the whole
absolutely.
ecosystem shifting before we get into more specifics?
I mean, I think certainly for me, it goes without saying that it's changed dramatically. I've been with SIGWATCH for just under 7 years. And when I joined, it was very much a focus on the major NGOs, understanding what they were saying in their campaigns, and they were really um, very prominent targets of stakeholder engagement, stakeholder management efforts, and also led a lot of the issues, right? So they were driving the narrative a lot of the time. What we've seen, both in our data and anecdotally over the last year in particular, is the activity and the influence of these major NGOs. And by this, what I mean very specifically actually is Greenpeace, WWF, Oxfam, these kinds of big campaigning, professionalized organizations, their activity has dropped relative to overall pressure activity globally. And I think their influence has dropped a lot as well. And actually, Chris, this is something that you and Mark can add to as well there. I think their influence has dropped, and I think the trust in their ability to affect change has dropped. And what's coming in their place is this sea of quite fragmented, fast-moving, very online, very digital first, not professionalized, and difficult to track smaller pressure groups that tend to be quite issue specific. And so I'll give you an example. We've seen these kinds of groups pop up around boycotts of Target in the US, for example. And there's a group that popped up called Latino Freeze, which is very specifically focused on one community and very specifically focused on one tactic, which is typically boycotts. And they're quite sort of opaque, which is not necessarily a sort of a red flag, but it means they're harder to engage with. And so what companies are facing now is this shift from, I mean, to put it crudely, I've got 5 NGOs on my speed dial, so I'm doing a good job and I'm plugged in and I know what's going on, to these NGOs that are on my speed dial aren't really driving these issues anymore, and all these groups are, and I don't know who they are, and I don't understand them, and I don't know what they're saying. And I can't see how these narratives are jumping. And that's really critical as well, is understanding how are these issues moving and what's important, and how does this impact your other stakeholders, your consumers, your employees, your investors, who are also hearing this and also paying attention to it.
And jumping, Charlotte, kind of means building, right? That even though this comes from a fragmented landscape, when we see jumping, that's when the issue is gaining momentum and having wider impact. Is that the right way to interpret that?
It is. I think when I speak about jumping, what I mean specifically is kind of the jump of narratives between jurisdictions or between industries. So it might be that there is, I'm trying to think of an example. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but there might be a grievance that's raised in regard to the energy industry in Nigeria, for example. And this is something, this narrative, this issue is something that we're only seeing in that very specific space. But all of a sudden, we see it targeting the energy industry in Germany. And it's a different group, it's not the same group, but the narrative has jumped, the narrative has shifted. And I think that is something that's really critical for companies to understand when they have a global footprint, is these issues don't respect borders. And so you have to understand how these groups are networked and how these issues are moving, so that you can have a really clear grip on what your issues landscape is.
And would the anti-ESG backlash be one of those examples? And in the work that you referenced, we know we also seen this perceived performance decline, according to sustainability stakeholders across the world, of NGOs' efficacy. And so
Yeah.
that has been quite precipitous. So I think in line with with your data. And it has all kinds of implications we could talk about. But then we've also seen this growing sense that this backlash is material, and it began very much in North America a couple of years ago, and it's spreading to other
Mhm.
jurisdictions now.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's something that we've been tracking over the course of this year. Is, I think we're monitoring about 200 groups in the US now, which would fall into this category of sort of anti-ESG or backlash groups, and they've cropped up mostly in the past couple of years. But we
200.
are 200,
Wow.
yeah, 200 that we have unearthed and are able to sort of track their talking points and their
And it's
issues.
and is your sense like 5 years ago they didn't exist? Is that
Some of them definitely didn't exist 5 years ago. Some of them did, but would have been campaigning on different issues, or maybe would have been smaller and less active. And some of them absolutely did. I mean, we talk about, for example, the Heritage Foundation has been around for a long time, and we would class that group as within that category now. But a lot of these groups didn't exist 2 or 3 years ago, or 5 years ago. But we are now starting to see those narratives jump to Europe. and the UK in particular. And so it really is about understanding not just things building momentum and growing in that way, but also how is this shifting globally and how is it changing according to the jurisdiction.
And correct me if I'm, but it's like working with SIGWATCH over the years. Historically, the sense of activism was always, and maybe I was falsely interpreting it, from a left of center progressive agenda, like
Mhm.
NGOs being the ones you referenced, the Greenpeaces to the Oxfams had a certain perspective, but now there is this more rightist activist agenda that I mean, did it exist beyond the heritage like, or is this a relatively new phenomenon that you're now tracking and engaging in?
It did exist, but it didn't exist in this way. And what do I mean by that? I mean, there are more groups certainly that would fall into this category now, but also the way that they're campaigning is different. And I
Mm.
think when we talk about pressure, when we talk about activism, we always think left wing because we know of the big groups and the big campaigns that would typically target either governments or companies to try and affect change.
Mm.
And that is a tactic that's been developed over many, many years and has been refined. What we're now seeing with the sort of right of center groups is that they're starting to adopt the same tactics. So rather than it being kind of an op-ed talking about a particular economic issue, we're now seeing these groups starting to call out companies in the same way as the sort of traditional left-wing activist groups do. I mean, Robbie Starbuck was a great example of that. He managed to have a really, really big impact in a very short space of time, and everyone was saying, "Well, what's going on?" He's invented some magical way to sort of get to corporations and force them to change their ways, but actually he was doing exactly what these major left-wing pressure groups have been doing for a decade. It was just coming from a slightly different source and on a different issue. But but I think to answer your question, yes, it did exist. No, it didn't exist in the same way. And that shift is what's making this different and important to keep an eye on.
And Charlotte, so listening to all that and agreeing with that picture of the landscape very much. In a way, this describes a civil society activist organization landscape that is more balanced, right? Like it's pushing from left and right, and it's people all across the political spectrum, kind of
Mhm.
pushing their values at governments and corporations and asking for certain actions in response. Whatever we think of anybody on that spectrum of organizations, does that make it harder for the organizations targeted to decide on an action? Because they're sort of facing, you lose both ways. One of the sets of organizations pressuring you from one side or the other is going to end up disappointed by your
Mhm.
response. How do folks act in this new landscape, which sounds harder to navigate? The prior one might have been a bit more binary, like we have to make a yes no choice, but this one seems a bit lose lose.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you, and I think it does in a way, it makes it much more difficult if we think about this as we have always thought about this, which is a demand is made of an organization, of a company, and you have to probably choose to act on it because it's the right thing to do. And if you don't, you're going to see a backlash. And I think that's how we've always thought of this. What I would say now is because this is coming from both sides, you must treat this as information rather than as an imperative. And that's sort of the direction that we're trying to steer in. It's not that there is a demand from a particular stakeholder and the company must bend to it, which I think for better or for worse, and you could argue both ways, has been kind of the dominant narrative for the last 10 years or so. Now it's you're getting a particular viewpoint of an issue from one side, you're getting a particular viewpoint of the same issue from the other side. The company still has to chart a course in the middle, and yes, there are significant um, danger areas there.
Mm.
But I think treating it as information from both sides and then using that to inform strategy is a much more sustainable and responsible way of dealing with this rather than just bending one way or the other because it's what public opinion demands.
Yeah, that resonates really strongly for me when you were using the word pressure early in the conversation, I was sort of building a list of synonyms in my head for what I thought pressure represented, and it was information, intelligence, insight. And then the
Exactly.
what do you do with it question becomes what's most important. How has this, Charlotte, changed the questions you're being asked by people who want to use the data SIGWATCH can produce? Is there change on that side too in terms of what people are seeking?
There is, and I think it is in exactly that vein. So I think there has been, anecdotally, from what I've seen, there has been a drop off in sort of senior leadership appetite for understanding pressure campaigns, because it feels a little bit like we've gone through this period where we've had to react to everything and prove that we're virtuous. And now we've come out the other side of that and we don't really need to care very much anymore,
Mm.
which obviously is, I think, wrong and irresponsible. Not just that it's wrong morally, but I think it's, in terms of business sense, it's wrong.
It's the less I know, the better strategy, which is
Exactly.
a principle
Exactly.
I live by most of the time.
Yeah, Chris,
Yes,
we'll
well,
come back to you and your personal issues later in the
I
conversation.
need my own. I need my own SIGWATCH. Go ahead.
Yeah.
yeah, so I think we've sort of come through that. Now there's less of an appetite for understanding this. And so what we're doing is helping the people that we work with to communicate internally, why is this still important, and why actually is it even more important than it ever was, because you still have to navigate this. You're still operating in the world. The world hasn't disappeared. This is still affecting your stakeholders. And now you really do need to understand it because it's coming from both sides. So treat it as information. Don't treat it as a big scary thing that you need to be afraid of and act on.
But it makes sense that I mean that if this fragmentation has transpired and it's a broader spectrum of pressure points, and some of these are contradictory, so it's not clear. I can see why it's taking companies a time to adjust on how they respond. Back to the analogy you had before, I've got 5 NGOs on speed dial. I know who to engage on these issues. Now, I mean, how do you engage in this fragmented place? It's like too many organizations, too many individuals to properly engage. I suppose that would be one of the tactics we companies have used have been that. And so now like, it's just absorbing information. And what if it's a net, like don't do anything is the best strategy.
Yeah, and it might be like that. That might be the best strategy, but the information has to inform that. And I think that's like you can't have 200 pressure groups on speed dial. I mean, you'd be a very busy person.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but that's kind of the gap that we're trying to plug. Is you don't need to necessarily be directly engaging with all of these groups. It would be impossible. And also, where would you find them? You'd be on Instagram and TikTok quite a lot.
Right.
But understanding the narratives and the issues they're putting forward and the arguments and the viewpoints, even at a data level, gives you a starting point. Like it gives you something to jump off of.
And Charlotte, now, in 2025, who's your customer? Like literally kind of like which function in an organization is the person that you've got on speed dial or vice versa? And yeah, I'm just curious about the intake and who's seeking and parsing the information, the intelligence from this very complicated landscape.
It's typically corporate affairs, sustainability, um, sort of any function around risk or communications.
Mhm.
We have investors using our data as well, so they use it as a sort of controversy data set. So it's reasonably broad, but it does sit within that sort of, we are engaging externally around these thorny issues, and so we need to understand them. Any function where that fits,
Mm.
that's who we would work with.
Great. And back to the implications on companies. I recall, I think, because you used the word devil at one point, and it wasn't the framework angels and devils that you and
Yeah.
Robert had developed. And can you tell us again, are the companies that have historically been visible and proactive on sustainability, don't they get an over proportion of campaigning against them despite the fact that they're quote unquote on the right side of history? Is that still the case? Or walk us through the level of commitment and advocacy that a company will do, and what that means from a targeting or pressure point.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely true. First, I'm gonna address, me calling companies devils because I think that needs some context.
Right.
Yeah.
This is how I get cancelled. We have a tool on the platform where we, sort of compare the amount of praise and criticism any given company gets, and in a very tongue-in-cheek way, we've named it, angels and devils, and then we've got sinners and saints in between, and so we categorize it in that way. Because what we're trying to do is sort of show, how are you perceived? Where do you fall here? And how does that affect how you engage? And you're absolutely right, Chris. Often what we find is the major companies that are very public about their sustainability initiatives and their efforts, they get a lot more flack than the companies which are maybe less of a household name, less well recognized, but doing a lot less on sustainability. Now, you might argue that sort of greenwashing plays into that a little bit. Okay, maybe you're very vocal on sustainability, but are you living up to it? And that certainly is an element. But the other element is that the way pressure groups work, I often describe them as, I mean, they're PR machines, like any PR consultancy or any company, really. You are looking to make the biggest splash you can because you're looking to affect change. And the way to do that is to grab people's attention. And so launching a campaign that talks about a very niche issue or a very niche industry or a very niche company, no one's going to pay attention to that.
Right.
But actually, if you're talking about a really major company, a household name, a brand that everyone knows, people are going to start paying attention. It will make the headlines. It will potentially spark consumer action, maybe a boycott, whatever it might be. And so that is how, in this theory of change, you make a difference. I think what that has led to, exactly as you describe, is the companies which feel as though they're really making an effort, they then kind of feel like they're getting a lot of pushback, a lot of backlash, which does an interesting thing emotionally internally because it makes people resent these groups, which is difficult and often not fair. But I think it, and Alison Taylor, who I know you both know, has talked a lot about this. I think it creates a barrier to real action because it becomes adversarial.
Yeah.
And you find people internally in these companies will get quite emotional about this, and they'll really feel very aggrieved and very upset as if it's something that's personally targeting them. And it's because they feel very proud of the work that they're doing and they think they're trying to make a difference. And then their company is getting attacked for it. And so, is it right? Is it wrong? I think that's a very nuanced discussion, but it certainly is true that it has caused difficulties.
And Charlotte, in that angels and devils spectrum, this goes back to one of my previous questions, but still kind of clarifying that you'd end up hard at one end of that, either angel or devil, based purely on the volume of criticism or praise, regardless of the nature of it. Like, does SIGWATCH also have an opinion on the type of criticism that an organization is facing and score it differently?
We wouldn't, no. So we would
Okay.
take into account the prominence of the criticism and the sort of level of it, the sentiment.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the quality of it, we're pretty agnostic on that because what we're trying to do is reflect the reality of what's out there.
Yeah.
And so while the criticism might be unjust in some people's opinion, or it might not entirely reflect the full picture, when we're talking about the effect that that has on the rest of the external environment and your other stakeholders, that doesn't always matter.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think Chris and I both found ourselves over the years in the position of counseling companies we've worked with on the it's never going to be fair.
Yeah.
These are the opinions that some people have, and they have chosen to direct them at you. And fortunately or unfortunately, that means you have to deal with them. And it really resonated with me what you said a minute ago too, that this becomes personal for folks. And there are a whole bunch of humans in the organizations on all sides of the conversation that we are talking about, and they end up holding and feeling these positions themselves as well as for their organizations. and then it makes the interaction hard. And we've also
Mm.
done lots of work on stakeholder engagement and how to make that productive and healthy. And the most complicated part of it is, of course, the people and the way they feel in the circumstance, regardless what the data says or what the organizations are specifically doing.
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, I've seen people visibly upset
Oh, yeah.
about this. And we have a client that we've worked with for a number of years now, who I have a very close relationship with. And our contact there always jokes that talking to me is like a therapy session, because most of the session is sort of dealing with that element of it, of that sort of feeling of grievance, and trying to separate that from, okay, but what's really going on and what are we going to do? Because it clouds judgments, and in a way that isn't productive, I think.
Mm. Are you seeing are there any tactics that are changing, you think, from a pressure group perspective?
Yeah, so we were doing a little bit of research on this week, just kind of playing around to see what shifted in the last few months. What we're seeing is the beginnings of more pressure on policymakers, I think. So
Mm.
a bit less of the maybe what we're all accustomed to, which is the direct action, the protests, the gluing yourself to things, the throwing paint on things, that kind of thing. I think that tactic really had its heyday in sort of 2018, 2019, and then hit a big barrier in terms of public opinion. Certainly in Europe and North America.
And the pandemic presumably too. I mean, it's really probably dampened all of that activism because we were all indoors for a couple of years.
I think it did, but then it kind of came back a little bit, but it came back in
Yeah.
a way that people didn't really like. And
Mm.
here I'm sort of referring more to the UK
The stop boilers sort of
context.
tactics and things like that.
Yeah, well, there was one in particular where it was Extinction Rebellion, I believe, and
Mm.
they had done a lot of really popular direct action stuff
Mm.
before the pandemic, and it was working brilliantly, and it had gotten a lot of public support. And then there's one action that stuck in my mind, which I can't remember what year it was. It was after the pandemic, I'm quite sure,
Mm.
where a protester got on top of the tube train and prevented it from going during rush hour. And so the effect of this was people taking mass transit instead of driving, who were trying to get to work and couldn't get to work and were delayed and stuck in a tube train. And obviously they were furious about this. And I think that kind of thing turned public opinion, um, which is a shame because some of the direct action stuff was effective. But there we go. But we're seeing a lot less of that now. I mean, it's still there, but it's proportionally we're seeing less of it, and we're seeing a lot more pushes for regulation, legislation, engagement with policymakers, demands on governments, this kind of thing. Maybe more kind of, I suppose you might call it institutional or policy
Mm.
focused.
Yeah, I think, and this is pure feeling for me, you would have the data, Charlotte, but those actions where somehow it became both personal for the people on the train again. So we're back to the personal part, how it's affecting them, their lives, their work, their ability to get to their families through their communities. And then the other aspect of that, and I'm curious if you have a view, was the various direct actions. And Chris referred to the gluing, and there was the paint throwing at art objects. There was, to me, a sense, as much as I look at this, of the hang on, those are public goods. And now somehow our public goods, art like our art history, is being drawn into a protest that is how involved, question mark. And why is that happening in my museum,
Mm.
when it's about this other issue? And any reflection on that, or might be a bit of a dead end, but
I think it is all contextual, right?
mm,
So I think I think maybe after the pandemic, there was like a weariness in society for this kind of thing. It was like, oh, we just want to get back to normal now. We just want to live our lives and sort of carry on and move forward. And that combined with the fact that there isn't really a clear link. I mean, there is if you're designing the theory of change and you're immersed in it, and this is your world and you can understand it. Then maybe there's a clear link between throwing paint at Stonehenge and tackling climate change. You can sort of see that, and you can build that, and you can make that case. But for Joe Public, scrolling the news on their phone in the morning, it doesn't make sense.
Mm.
Um, and I think that disconnect with general public opinion is what caused a lot of the problems there.
Mm.
And if we put a, I mean, I don't know, you know better than we do, but we put like peak NGO, peak traditional NGO being like, 2019 or something like that. And since then, we're in a different era of this decline of the big NGOs' efficacy, engagement, ability to influence, it seems, because the fragmentation. And now we have a broader ideological spectrum of activist groups. So that's quite a that's a dramatic change on its own. And then we have this attention economy thing, which we're all trying to understand a bit more too. And that is the scrolling, it's the eyeballs, so the unexpected things. And I guess that's why some of the tactics probably came up of gluing yourself to a Rembrandt or something like that. Um, but I don't know how this works out because the attention economy seems to me it's not there's huge contradictions, there's lack of consistency, but it is all about eyeballs, like that, and it's flooding the zone as a strategy. So I wonder what this means going forward for the pressure landscape.
I think it's all about eyeballs. It's all about consistent and compelling narratives and simple connections that make sense and making things real for people. And an example of this that we're starting to see, in fact, one of my colleagues was just telling me about this yesterday. We're seeing groups in the US that campaign on issues related to energy, maybe pollution, climate change, whatever it might be, moving away from sort of social justice narratives, so sort of kind of larger progressive human rights focused narratives, and focusing much more on the issues within the communities that they are trying to target.
Mm.
And so it's taking these sort of big ideas and making them real for people. Now, how's that going to
Very
play out?
localized, right?
Exactly. We don't know how that's going to play out just yet, but I think that is the way to cut through at this point. I think it's about making things local. I think it's about grounding them in realism and moving towards an attempt to have real dialogue and back and forth rather than like pushing and pulling in one direction or the other.
Mm.
I mean that's idealism, and is it realistic? I'm not sure, but I think that would be the way to go.
And also forward-looking, Charlotte, if it's fair to characterize much of our conversation so far as being about which actors are doing things and how they are doing it. Chris sort of moved us partway forward, I think, to is it also changing the issues of focus, or are the same issues the ones that are being pushed, promoted, forming the pressure, but to what you just said about taking it to a local level through a different frame. Can you forecast, over the next couple of years, a few new emerging issues we might want to keep an eye on?
Oh, get my crystal ball out. Is it changing issues? Yes and no. I think the meta issues are here to stay. I think climate change is not going anywhere. Human rights, um, decent living standards, poverty, these things are not going anywhere. But the way that we talk about them and the way that we frame them is changing.
Mm.
And I think we've been seeing that for a number of years, right? Like I think if I think of Europe, when the Russian invasion of Ukraine first happened, and all of a sudden we saw groups that were focused on energy policy having to switch to talk about cost of living. Now, the demands were still the same. They were still asking for the same things, but the way that they were framing it, the way that they were talking about it to connect with people was different. And I think that's what we're going to see going
Mm.
forwards.
Mm.
Um, so in terms of my crystal ball, I would hesitate to sort of pick out one or two major issues at this stage, but I think broadly everything will be much more connected to the local, to people's experiences of the day-to-day life, which for most people is particularly in Europe and the US, for whatever reason, and there are obviously arguments behind this, is feeling harder, is feeling more tense, is feeling sort of there's a discontent there. And I think the way that we talk about issues is going to be trained and grounded in that. Um, although the meta narratives and the demands and all of that might not necessarily change and doesn't necessarily have to.
Yeah. And if I can pick up on one thing you had embedded in there, Charlotte, as well, it's the North America and Europe versus the rest of the world. Are you seeing the tactics and or the issues playing out differently presently in APAC and Latin America and Africa? And how does SIGWATCH avoid getting trapped, as my and Chris's organizations do, with some of the research we do as well, in a European North America perspective, too often?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky, particularly with what we're working with, because a lot of these pressure groups, this civil society, does come out of Europe and North America. And there are some countries in the world where there is almost no activity on this level. And so we are always trying to keep our coverage as global as possible. But by virtue of what we're looking at, a lot of it is sort of, inverted commas, global north focused.
Mhm.
Having said that, we have always seen a difference between how issues are framed globally. I mean, if we think again about the energy industry, if we look at most African countries, a lot of the issues that are coming out of there are more social justice oriented. They are more grounded in the realities of how people are experiencing their environment rather than sort of broad focus climate change as a big issue that we all need to focus on. And so I think that already exists, and possibly it's Europe and North America kind of catching up to that a little bit. You could maybe see it that way.
Mhm.
But it absolutely is difficult to sort of keep that balance, and it's something that we're focused on, definitely.
And then the magnitude of focus from an issues perspective on environment versus the social economic side of things is that changing or shifting, or is there a balance on those things, or is it broadly environmental where most of the pressure conversations are, or is it beyond that?
Oh, it's still broadly environmental,
Mm.
but with elements of the economic and with elements of, I mean, for example, something that we're focusing a lot on at the moment in the US is the public health conversation,
Mhm.
which at the moment is really around food and additives and ingredients, and that's something that we've been monitoring. But there's massive scope there for that to affect issues like pollution and the energy industry and agriculture. And this is coming from, the MAHA, Make America Healthy Again side of things. If there's scope for them to turn their attention away from food, focusing on public health and children's health, actually, which is really the
Mm.
driving force here,
Huh.
to look at pollution from whatever industry it is and say, this is something that's affecting my family and the health of my children. Now, all of a sudden, we've got a completely different issue. We've got a completely different stakeholder landscape for these industries that they're not prepared for, and that it's coming from a base that they'd always thought of as broadly supportive of their business and their industry and their efforts. And so I think what I'm trying to say is the issues remain the same, but the framing and how it's shifting and how that's grounded in how people are living opens up a lot of new risks and opportunities as well.
Fantastic. Any last questions for you, Mark?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about a summary one, and Charlotte, you uh, in a way, it feels like you've worked so hard to be reasonably neutral in describing all of this to us, and so I wonder, in looking at all the data and information that you have access to, and the therapy sessions that you have with your clients, what motivates you right now, and what keeps you hopeful going forward? Like, what's your passion to continue doing this work? Be a nice note to go out on.
It's a good question. This is how they break down the politicians, isn't it? Um, what keeps me motivated? I think I see how confused and fractured things are,
Mm.
and how many people there are trying to improve things, both on the business side and in pressure groups and in society. And sometimes, and this goes for our political situations at the moment as well, right?
Mm.
It feels like everyone's just yelling into a void, and there's a lot of emotion and not a lot of understanding what's happening and dealing with it. and sort of trying to find a way forwards. And I think I hope that I speak for the SIGWATCH team at large as well here. I think that's what motivates us, is taking something that's incredibly emotional and incredibly polarized and polarizing,
Mm.
and just making it information that people can make good decisions off the back of. Because I think that is one of the main ways that we go forward from here.
Providing a little bit more reason over passion, which is
Yeah,
which sounds like a good thing that this world needs right now. So yeah,
uh-huh.
that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Charlotte. Thank you for all your work and what you do, and it is deeply fascinating. And we could have gone down many different avenues to kind of get more specific. So we recommend anyone who doesn't know SIGWATCH check him out. And you post prolifically on LinkedIn, and they're always fascinating articles. So thank you so much to you and to the SIGWATCH team and to Robert as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was really great.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. Hugely enjoyed here as well.
And thanks everyone for this for tuning in. Please share the link to this podcast if you found it useful, and of course you did. It was fascinating and super useful. And give us a rating if you can. And we'll talk to you next time.